Table saws are pretty awesome. And if you're watching this video, you might not have one. Table saws can be both bulky and pretty expensive. So the reality is you might not even need one. Today I'm going to show you how to make 10 different table saw cuts using a circular saw with some cool accessories. I'm going to list these out from the easiest to the most difficult. Then we're going to wrap up the video by building a cool project with those same tips. I put a few insulation boards on my bench top, and this is where we're going to be making our cuts. Most circular saws should have a little lever that lets you adjust the depth of the cut. This is important because you don't always want to cut entirely through the material. In many cases, you'll also have a cut depth indicator. Most circular saws should also have a tilting feature, which allows you to change the angle of the cut. First things first, let's swap out the blade. And don't forget to remove the battery when you're making this type of adjustment. Now we can get started. Cross-cutting. Cutting wood across its grain to resize the board. Using your speed square, you can mark your cut line at a perfect 90-degree angle. Then line up any straight reference guide and complete your line. Freehanding is quick and convenient, but not very accurate. Even with a line marking 90 degrees, it's very difficult to follow that. Table saws essentially have a small fence that guides the cut. And you can do that same thing using a board that's perfectly straight. Use the speed square to line the straight board up, and keep in mind that the actual blade will have a certain distance from this guide. Clamp your straight guide to your cutting piece and keep in mind that distance that I just talked about. Because of that space we measured out, I know that every guided cut will be 1 1/8 of an inch away from that board. And that 90-degree cut is a lot more consistent now. If you want something more reliable than a wooden board, this is your solution. This is the Kreg straight edge guide. And since it's made out of aluminum, its shape won't change like a wooden board over time. This accessory also has a built-in clamping system that references the line you drew. The setup is quick, easy, and reliable with this guide. A bit versatile too, since you can also use jigsaws and routers. Now onto rip cutting. Cutting wood along its grain lengthwise. You can set up pretty much any straight guide along the length of a board. Be sure to use a speed square like earlier, and then clamp your piece down. Just keep in mind the material that you're using as a guide, especially since boards tend to warp over time. For more consistent results, you might want to use something like the Kreg Rip Cut. This guide has its measurements marked out, and the adjustment is as simple as sliding the piece over. You can easily secure your circular saw using only 2 screws. Alright, so what's the deal with Kreg? I contacted them about my video idea on how to get by without a table saw. They were super receptive to that and agreed to a sponsorship. To make the video possible, they paid for the material that we're using here, and they provided these 2 accessories. And this is all so that more projects are accessible to people without a table saw. So thank you, Kreg, for making this possible. Now that you saw the rip cut, we can go back to the straight edge guide. The XL version of this has some extensions so that you can make longer cuts. You'll find that both of these accessories have their strengths. The straight edge guide can be used here, but nothing beats the quick measurements on the rip cut. Mitered cuts. Cutting precise angles using a miter gauge or a sled. Among the many markings on a speed square, some of these indicate the angle of the cut. And since I have an extra one, I'm going to give one away. Leave a comment with a red square emoji and you might win it. Putting the speed square's lip on a board will give you the 90-degree line. But when you tilt the speed square along that pivot point, you start getting some fancy angles. On the pivot, that 15-degree line is aligned with my board, which means that the opposite end is now marking 15 degrees. And you can see how that differs from the 90-degree lines next to it. You can freehand these cuts, but it's much easier to set up a guide. I normally just grab a clamp, I line up that reference angle one more time, Then I lock it in place. And again, line that angle up with the corresponding side of the board. The other side of the speed square is going to have that exact angle. And that's something that you can now use as a guide for your circular saw. That cut will match that same angle. Beveled cuts, tilting the blade to cut the wood at a specific angle. If you're having trouble visualizing it, this is what it looks like. Remember the mechanism that tilts your saw blade? You're going to use that now. Set that to the angle that you're trying to cut. Then you can use the straight edge guide to guide that cut. Just keep in mind the distance from your guide to the blade changes because of the tilt of the angle. So if it's going to be a cut you measure it out precisely, be sure to test this on scrap pieces of wood first. Now on to step 4.5. Like and subscribe. It helps the channel a ton and it'll give more opportunities to make videos like this in the future. Tapered cuts, cutting the board at an angle to achieve a thinning thickness. Instead of having a blocky leg, you can make it look a little bit better with a tapering effect. Lengthwise, I marked the halfway point, then I made another mark on the edge of the board a few inches up. Measuring these 2 points out gives you consistency, so that you can keep making identical furniture legs. From there, clamp your board down, and you can freehand your cut. The cut might be a little rough initially, but you can always sand it afterward to make it a little more smooth. And I don't have a piece of furniture, but let's pretend for a second. I definitely prefer this modern look over a traditional blocky leg. Rabbet cuts, cutting notches along the edge of the wooden board for joinery. I like to make realistic cuts, and for me, that means measuring things out based on the thickness of my material instead of using a ruler. The plywood here is 3/4 of an inch, but the reality is it might vary. To fit that material, I adjusted the cut depth of the circular saw to about 3/8 of an inch. This will put us about halfway into the material and allow us to create a notch for our other piece. I set up the straight edge guide and I used it like a fence for the initial cut. After that, I slowly scooted the blade in the other direction and gave the board enough passes to significantly reduce the material there. Once that's done, cleanup is super easy with a chisel. And now you have some space for the wood glue and the mating board. The straight edge guide also works great with a wood router, and the results are way cleaner too. If you're not familiar with this one, this tool essentially rotates a blade and removes material. And all you have to do is measure the distance to the straight edge guide. This is going to vary from the circular saw, since this is a different tool. And as you can see, the results are super clean. This joint is super useful because giving the wood a place to sit helps the wood glue bond the two boards. Dado cuts, creating grooves or channels using a dado blade. This is similar but different. Instead of being on the edge, these cuts can be pretty much anywhere. And with that space marked out, the markers on the straight edge guide make easy work of this cut. The main difference here is that you're also going to have to set up the straight edge guide on the other side. And this is going to be to prevent you from going over that other line. Once you've removed enough material, you can clean it up with a chisel again. And just like last time, a perfect fit. The rib cut also helps a ton when it comes to dado cuts. The guided slide and the marked out measurements make it really easy to reference where you're at. With every pass, it's easy to slide the blade over a fraction of an inch and keep making those cuts. Some might say it's almost too easy. Kerf cuts, cutting grooves into the board to achieve a curve. And fun fact, I had never done this one before, so this one was cool to see. For this to work, I had to adjust the blade's cut depth. I set it below every plywood layer except the last. With every pass, I adjusted my blade over about 3/8 of an inch. The rib cut makes the adjustments both easy and consistent. This can definitely take some trial and error, but the best way to do it is to make each cut and then test your curve. I had seen this done in videos, but doing it in person was just so different. It looks awesome. Using this technique gave me some ideas for the future. Maybe a desk of some sort. Half lap joints. Removing equal material from two sections, allowing for them to overlap. Let's pretend this is a furniture leg again. And let's make it a fancy furniture leg. So we're going to cut an angle into it. I showed how to cut angles earlier, so feel free to refer to that if you need to. These are cut using a 15-degree angle, so that angle was cut into both the leg and the stretcher, and you're going to see that in just 1 second. When using angles, the angle on the two pieces has to match in order for them to correspond to each other. So now we can start mapping that out. The two pieces have to overlap, and we're going to remove enough material so that they can sit flush. I used my combination square to mark the halfway point in the material. That same amount of material has to get removed from both boards. I set the saw blade to match that depth, and then I started making passes on the material, knowing the depth is controlled. And with this joint, it's also a good idea to put a board on the other side, since that board will make sure that the circular saw's base is supported. I chiseled out the leftover material, and when you're done with both boards, they should be ready for wood glue and a clamp. Not too bad for a circular saw. The tongue and groove cuts. Connecting two mating pieces for joinery using a tongue and groove. That description didn't help much. It's a strong joint where the two pieces fit into each other. With some wood glue, a joint like that is much stronger than a joint like this. I lined the pieces up and I marked the material for reference. Then I marked the halfway point on the board that was on the bottom. I moved 1/8 of an inch one way and then I marked that line. Then I did the same, but in the other direction. And similar to the half lap joint, I marked about half the thickness in the material. Outlining these pieces is going to let us know what material we need to remove. The saw blade is set to match that depth, and this is a more precise process, so I'm also using a clamp and a speed square. And measuring this depth one more time, we can make the mating piece. Your goal here is to make the other piece the exact opposite of what that original piece is. You're going to cut off the opposite material of what you removed the first time. And here's where I made a slight mistake, but it's an easy fix. I made the mating piece too thin, and that's because I measured it against the saw blade in the wrong orientation. I measured the depth vertically instead of horizontally. And so you can see, this is far too thin. I measured again off camera and redid my piece. And this is what it should really look like. A little bit of wood glue in there, and dare I say, that's not going anywhere. Alright, so here's the lightning round. Let's build a project, and let's do it fast. I started with a large board, and began ripping it down using the rip cut. I set the cut to 7 inches and 3/4, then I made that cut twice, and that gave me 2 boards of identical size. While everything is accessible, I sanded the boards using 220 grit sandpaper. Then I measured out the halfway point in each board. Then I used the rip cut a little bit off to the side of that line. The goal was to keep shifting over and eventually make a groove for another board. I turned the first board over, then I marked 3 cut lines 9 inches apart, and the last one was about 20 inches. Then I marked a 90-degree line on those sections using my speed square, and I threw down some painter's tape before the cut, since this helps protect the board from any tear out. Then I started laying out my boards to give me a rough idea of what this project would look like. And for this project to come together smoothly, we're going to need a few beveled cuts. This means we're going to have to make a 45-degree cut on every mating piece. And those marks are just to make sure that I don't get confused throughout the cutting process, especially since I'm making the cut from the bottom of the piece here. The straight edge guide makes easy work of these beveled cuts. I recently bought some 90-degree clamps, and this was a good project to put those to the test. Before joining those pieces, just be sure to apply a thin layer of wood glue. Corner clamps are super useful, but if you don't have any, you can honestly build this entire thing with painter's tape. You really just need a little bit of tension there while the glue dries. But since I have the clamps, it makes sense to use them. I only had 4 of these clamps, so as proof of concept for what I said about the tape, here you go. 2 of the boards are held up only by tape. After the wood glue dried the next day, I added the remaining boards into those grooves that we talked about under the piece. The idea with those grooves is to make them so close in size to the plywood that they just click into place when you put them in. To cover up the plywood edges, I used this thing called edge banding. It's a little roll of wood that you can iron onto the edges, and it's intended to match your sheet of plywood. And this means that the edge banding is going to need some 45-degree cuts too. After measuring out your pieces, you can literally just iron them on. This melts the adhesive on the backside and creates a bond. After ironing on all the pieces, I also took some time to sand them using a gentle 220 grit sandpaper. Then I moved on to coloring the wood with some wood stain. And this is the Varathane Early American shade. All you have to do is let the wood soak it up and then wipe it off with a clean rag. Give it an hour to dry, and then you can hit it with the Varathane water-based polyurethane. This is a clear coat that'll help keep this piece protected. Give it 2 to 3 thin coats, and then give it a few hours to dry. Then you're all done. Thanks again, Kreg, for everything you've done. Without you, this project wouldn't have been possible until much later. These are genuinely some high quality products, and I can't emphasize how much I recommend them. I'll leave some links to those in the description. Be sure to check them out. Thanks again.